Re:Zero, Arc 8, Chapter 17, A Magical Approach.
As much as it was necessary, the certainty that this was an unprecedented situation only grew deeper. Among the events that had taken place in Lagunica recorded in the history books, was a case resembling this unusual situation, but in that sequence of events, the case was not treated as anything major, the demi-human war. It was a mass-scale civil war that occurred in Lagunica's past, and much like the current situation, it was the only recorded instance in history where the dead rose as enemies. However, the main focus of the history books were more on the friction between the human and demi-human tribes, and the extraordinary attacks carried out as part of the civil war had not been recorded in detail. That was regrettable. Had the details of that time been recorded in more depth? I'm not gonna fall behind these guys. With a roar and a swing of his fist, a group of imperial soldiers, each pallid in complexion, were blown away all at once. Riding off the energy that had been vigorously drawn up from the ground he firmly stepped on, he unleashed a blow with all of his might, one that was perhaps closer to a cleave than a punch. In quick succession he repeated the attack a second and third time, with each blow knocking down the enemy's formation. No, it was not anything impressive like a formation. At first glance, the silhouettes of the enemy approached side by side, but they had no such thing as tactical leadership, coordination, or strategy. If that were the case, they were simply a cluster of individuals. If they were merely a cluster of individuals, Garfield would not be caught lagging behind. However, Zua, with a sharp lunge, a double slash grazed Garfield's neck. Feeling his hair standing on end, he glared at his opponent. Having suddenly appeared kicking away the fragments of a shattered undead, was another undead clad in an air different from the others. Garfield, TCH, with a click of his tongue, he raised his shoulder and checked his neck, where the tip of the sword had slightly grazed him. The extent of the slash was about a finger's length difference between the first and second blows. It was the technique of a master who deliberately demonstrated a dodgeable blow, then tried to cut off the opponent's head with a second. They were nothing more than a cluster of individuals without any formation, but occasionally among them, there were those who had this level of skill. As a result, it had become a bit more troublesome than expected, and he assumed that there was one skilled undead out of every 20. Because of this, he could not carelessly support his allies by saying that they would be fine as long as they worked together. Based on one assessment of the situation, it was quite possible that a formation of 100 men could be destroyed by a single skilled undead. Skilled undead, Zua. Garfield wrinkled his nose, whereupon the undead again unleashed the same double slash. Contrary to what had just been shown, the range of the technique had changed to be more daring. Earlier, the difference was a fingertip's worth, and now it was a fist's worth. A deep cut the size of a fist would be fatal, no matter how shallow the cut was. However, the undead who had unleashed the technique widened his eyes, a face in stark contrast to that of one confident in victory. The reason was simple: their right arm, which had been holding the sword, had been shattered at the wrist. Garfield, no matter how many obvious tricks you play, your grip on the sword is always in the same position when you slash. The three-headed Velgrain has but one body, He switched over to shatter the left hand, and then drove his fist into his opponent's astonished face. As soon as the impact of the blow passed through to the back of its head, the undead's head was blown away as if it were a fruit bursting open. As its head crumbled, fissures went through its torso and legs, and its whole body shattered. Garfield, this ain't to my liking. Looking down upon the wreckage of his vanquished foe, Garfield voiced those words. What irritated Garfield was the way the undead were defeated and destroyed. Since these things were dead, it would not be appropriate to describe it as a way of dying, and more than anything else, the very way they shattered deprived Garfield of the feeling that he was fighting against something that had life. All that remained was a faint cold sensation, questioning just what in the world he was fighting against. Garfield wiped the sweat from his chin with his arm, and when he looked around, he saw an incessant stream of undead soldiers on the night plains that had become the battlefield. In order to combat them, a tactical delay force, which included Garfield, was in the midst of fighting hard. Initially, Garfield had been assigned to a medical unit in order to make good use of his healing magic, but the policy of preventing people from getting injured suited Garfield's nature better than treating the injured. Petra, Garf-san, your fidgeting is worrisome. If you're so restless, go help the people fighting yourself, so said Petra, who was working hard in the same medical unit as Garfield. Though it was not because she had insisted, Garfield rushed outside. In reality, as a volunteer, he thought he was producing some good results. However, he was not so conceited as to say that he was doing the best work here. The reason was, do it. A sharp yell echoed in the black of the night, immediately after which the sound of drawn bowstrings firing rang out in succession. In accordance with the yell from Tarata, the chieftain of the people of Shudrak, a tremendously dense hail of arrows was fired. Rather than as individual arrows, they fell as a single cluster that left no means to dodge. The only way to evade them was to either catch or repel all of them. In fact, the undead, having no choice but to suffer the attack, each tried to utilize their weapons and shields. However, Kuna, I see it. Holly, go for it. The undead, focused on the sky overhead, were struck by a heavy-duty arrow fired from a strong bow by an assertive voice. Literally, to say that they were shot through would be an understatement. That absurd impact was like being rammed by a full-speed dragon carriage. The undead that assumed a defensive stance were blown away along with the group behind them at the same time. Garfield, my amazing self ain't supposed to lose to ya, but that's fucking insane. The undead who were weak were eradicated by the rain of arrows which dominated the area, and the undead who were strong and survived that attack were sniped by the strong bow. The rhythm of the coordinated hunters greatly impressed Garfield. Even for Garfield, his movements would halt if he was turned into a hedgehog from getting pierced by arrows, and then in addition to that was the huge damage from the strong bow which he could not dodge. He considered it a relief to have those tactics on his side. Garfield, well, I got no idea what's happening over there. In contrast to the great strength of the Shudrak, another group won Garfield's admiration in a different way. They accompanied Subaru, who should have fought alone in the Empire. They were a group who all looked rough, the self-proclaimed Pleiades Battalion. Pleiades, we will do it, we will do it, we will do it, we will do it. Pleiades, strongest. Invincible. Superior. Superior. Pleiades, UO. They were abnormally loud in the midst of a nighttime battle, and Garfield's eye could not spot anyone as being exceptionally skilled in martial prowess. Of course, many of them seemed to have refined their techniques to the level of an imperial soldier. At any rate, it was hard to say if the majority of them were trained, but they were good at giving in to their instincts and the way they raged about. But even so, they were strong. Already, the difference in physical strength was like an adult compared to a child. It's beautiful. Their strength is refreshing. A voice reached Garfield, who was staring at the way the Pleiades battalion fought. When he turned his head, lined up next to him was a woman with dark brown skin and dyed red hair. Myzelda. Myzelda, who had a single wooden leg, wore a smile the color of blood towards the battalion's violent fighting style. Garfield, I don't get it, but they have something to do with Captain. I do wonder what they're doing, but I ain't worried that it's bad. Myzelda, Captain. Subaru, is it? Emilia and the others, they put great faith in him. Garfield, faith? A word like that is an understatement. Captain's a man who gives back my amazing self's expectations and faith 100 times over. It was neither an exaggeration nor a bluff. From the bottom of his heart, Garfield held zero doubt in praising him in such a way. At Garfield's answer, the quality of Myzelda's smile changed, from a mask of war, to something that was somehow calmer and harbored a sense of understanding. Myzelda, I also understand that feeling. In the Lifeblood ritual and in all the subsequent battles, Subaru continued proving himself to us. He has the soul of a warrior. Though he may not have a good face for a man, he'd make a good husband for Tarata. Garfield, stop talking 'bout his face. The captain also worries about the look in his eyes. Besides, Myzelda, Garfield, no matter how much you've been charmed by Captain, there's someone that he's already decided to fall for. Myzelda, I see. That's right. Garfield rubbed his nose with his finger, and Myzelda nodded profoundly. He was unsure to what extent were her words a joke and to what extent were they genuine praise, but the fact that Subaru was also valued within this empire made Garfield proud. Wherever he was, Subaru involved the people around him and brought about great results. However, though Subaru could get on exceedingly well wherever he found himself, it was the wish of Garfield and the collective will of the entire camp to have him stay with them. It was for this reason that everyone went through great lengths to rush to the heart of the empire, Garfield, and yet, they had the nerve to get in the way of our amazing selves reuniting with the captain, HK. Garfield was a military officer, one who loved to compete against the strong. But, he was not a battle junkie who chose to fight anyone and everyone, no matter the time or place, to reunite with an important companion, to be in a situation in which that delightful reunion time was interrupted by constantly appearing enemies filled his heart not with happiness, but solely with hatred. Garfield, but, they sure are a weird-ass lot, aren't they? My Zelda, the dead coming back to life is unnatural. I understand what you're saying, Garfield. That ain't what I meant, my Zelda, dash. His fangs creaked as he bit them together. My Zelda raised an eyebrow at Garfield's mutter. In a purposeful response to her doubt, Garfield jerked his chin, directing his gaze towards a group of undead that was still being targeted by the Shudrak's arrows. Garfield, look closely and you can tell. There ain't a surefire way to kill these guys. Some break with one arrow, while others don't, even with 5 arrows in 'em. My Zelda, there are also some tough beasts. Just like people. Isn't it the same thing, Garfield? I know the difference between strong and weak. This ain't like that. He could not explain it well, but from Garfield's view, even among the undead appearing roughly equal in strength, he sensed a difference in their level of toughness. Whether an arrow hit a vital spot or not seemed to have little relevance. Some seemed to be unaffected even when an arrow pierced an eye, while others shattered from a single arrow lodged in their shoulder. It felt as if simply gauging them by the strength or weakness of their life force. Garfield, damn it. You thinking about it hurts my head. It's a guilty law that fell one step short. If we you crush 'em all, I ain't matter anyway. Roswell, that is exactly how a guilty law that fell one step short would think. Isn't it? At that moment, Garfield's shoulders jolted in response to the voice descending from above his head. When he hastily looked up, there was a silhouette leisurely approaching from the thickly clouded night sky. It steadily grew into the shape of a man that Garfield could not stand, and then, Roswell, since you are struggling, let me give you a hand. Garfield, Dudley, you bastard. Roswell, oops. I feel bad saying this after you had finally gotten used to my alias, but after the meeting we had earlier, there's no longer a need to hide my name. So, as usual, you can, Garfield, fucking Roswell. Roswell, while there is an unnecessary prefix, but you can call me that, I don't mind. Indeed, Roswell, who had landed on the ground, was laughing, provoking Garfield's irritation. Since infiltrating into Wallachia, he may have concealed his facial makeup and outlandish costumes, but his unique manner of speaking, which likewise should have been sealed away, had returned. Hearing that the pseudonym was also lifted, it could be inferred that the discussion in the dragon carriage had probably been settled. The negotiations that Otto, Frederica, and the others had mentioned before, to reach a consensus regarding their involvement with the Empire without twisting Subaru and Emilia's feelings. That in itself was a joyous thing for Garfield. Garfield, if you finished talking, I'd like to hear how it turned out. Beatrice. Have you changed sides? It's rare to see you to be with that bastard. Beatrice, it's out of necessity, in fact.
If possible, Betty would rather not leave Subaru's side for even a second, I suppose.
But, it can't be helped since I'm being relied upon, in fact. With that said, Beatrice flung herself out of Roswell's arms. Since it was for just 1 month, Beatrice being active even in Subaru's absence is still fresh in her memory, so now that she somehow managed to reunite with Subaru, Garfield thought that she would have been resolved to never leave his side again. In fact, just before everyone was about to smother the awoken Subaru in the coupled dragon carriage, the girl had been mumbling along those lines with a completely determined look in her eyes, for her to leave Subaru's side, and come to the battlefield with Roswell. Beatrice, Garfield, I am here to ascertain the origin of that unease you felt, I suppose. Garfield, the origin of the unease. Roswell, if you go into a battle without knowing your enemy, the results will amount to less than half of what you expected. You compensate for this by knowing your enemy. Especially this enemy, who is shrouded in far too many mysteries. After letting go of Beatrice, Roswell swung his arms as if feeling somewhat lonely. At the words of those two, Garfield felt optimistic about the outcome of the conversation, and his fighting spirit surged, even though the bearer of this message was the despised Roswell. My Zelda, not Dudley, but Roswell. That's your real name then? Roswell, yes, Miss My Zelda. Due to certain reasons, I had to falsify my name. I do apologize. Not only I, but also Emilia Summer, who you knew as Emma Yili, had to do the same. My Zelda, it was done by a man with a nice face. So you are forgiven. Beatrice, what an outrageous basis for a decision. In fact, My Zelda digested the issue of the pseudonyms with her own peculiar sense of values. Beside her, Garfield gazed towards the pair of Roswell and Beatrice, and, Garfield, so, the fight's gonna continue in the Empire, and the reason you two came is, Beatrice, events outside the realm of reason are best identified by magicians who have the ability to interfere with reason, I suppose. Roswell, this is a historic collaboration between Lagunica and Wallachia. The most valuable thing the kingdom can offer in return to them is a magical approach to determining the SARS. If the knowledge of a mage could help to identify the cause of the endless stream of undead, then surely there was no one in Emilia's camp better qualified to help than Roswell and Beatrice. Emilia was a spiritual arts user, Ram was the type to rely on her senses, and Petra was still in the process of learning. Roswell, how has it been actually fighting them for a prolonged period? Have you grasped anything, Garfield? I don't really get the difference between the ones that are easy to beat and the ones that are hard to beat. I think there's a reason apart from whether they're strong or weak, but, Roswell, So the survivability and vitality of each individual is different. Garfield inwardly clicked his tongue at Roswell, who was in thought with a long, slender finger on his chin. It was true that he did not like Roswell's every move, but the tongue click just now was not due to irritation with him, but rather for the fact that he was counting on his thoughts and knowledge, because he honestly thought that Roswell was reliable in this situation. Beatrice, Roswell, looking at it in a daze won't lead to the answer. In fact, Roswell agreed. Well then, if it comes to this. Beatrice, how much mana do you have left? Beatrice, after having met with Subaru, I'm feeling perfect, I suppose. Roswell, very well. Theen, suddenly smiling, Roswell's heterochromatic eyes narrowed, and soon after, 4 different colored lights, mana, floated in the air around him. Roswell snapped his fingers, and the 4 colored lights raced through the darkness of the night at arrow-like speeds, piercing into the distant group of undead, each light displaying their own powers. One of the undead burst into flames, and another was encased in ice. One had its limbs severed by a blade of wind, and one was pierced through the groin by a block of rock that rose up from the ground. All of them were fatal wounds, a destructive force that shattered them into infinitesimal pieces with a cracking sound a second later. Garfield, and even My Zelda, raised their eyebrows slightly in surprise at the result. Roswell, as it was reported, it's the fire attribute that works the most effectively. Wind did poorly, and earth is treated no differently than a physical strike. Freezing seems to be inefficient with its mana consumption. However, to Roswell, the executor of the attack, it was not the fact that the undead were defeated, but rather how the strength of the attacks affected the defeated undead. And then, Beatrice had also begun the same examination, but in a different way than Roswell. Beatrice, Vita. Beatrice held her hand up to the night sky, and her chanted magic meddled with the rain of arrows, which was released by the people of Shudrak, as the arrows tore through the sky. Innumerable arrows poured down upon the undead, their weight multiplied several times by the effects of Beatrice's yin magic that altered the weight of its target. The increase in their power could be gauged from the spectacular sound that came from each undead as they were pierced into the ground. Beatrice, as Garfield said, there is no explanation for why some zombies crumble, and others don't, even though the arrows are of different weights and have different power. In fact, Garfield, if you make all the arrows heavier, won't it be hard to tell the difference? Beatrice, don't think so lowly of Betty, I suppose. Instead of making all of the arrows the same weight, each arrow was tested differently. In fact, Beatrice appeared angry, puffing out her cheeks like a little girl, but her reply in an effort to not be treated like a fool was even more foolish. Garfield, as a person who could use magic, albeit specializing in healing magic, understood the precision of the magical manipulation that Beatrice was doing. One could see that what she had just done with magic was of equal difficulty to threading many needles at once without using one's hands. Moreover, Beatrice and Roswell were. Roswell, the cause of their crumbling is not the loss of their limbs. Some of them are still alive even after having their vitals gouged out. Although they are humanoid in appearance, it is better not to think of them as living creatures. Beatrice, it's not easy for anyone other than you to treat them like they're not living creatures when they're laughing, angry, and even talking, I suppose. Maybe it's contingent on the accumulation of a certain amount of damage. In fact, Roswell, that's quite an insulting assessment. I've spent a lot of time with all of you, and I think I've regained a lot of my humanity. Some of them can be taken down with just one leg blown off. If it's a condition of damage accumulation, it doesn't add you up. Beatrice, it's a ridiculous argument to settle it as a simple difference in individual endurance, I suppose. Roswell, what other reason could there be? The flow of mana is uniform. Beatrice, indeed, it is uniform. Wait, in fact, it's way too uniform, I suppose. While exchanging banter with each other, Roswell and Beatrice's investigation of the enemy progressed. Surprisingly, as they discussed, the two of them checked the disposition of the undead who attacked them, using their respective areas of magical expertise. Fire, wind, and purple arrows raged, and the undead were unable to get close to the two as they fought back to back. Of course, Garfield and Myzelda also attacked the undead to keep them away, but even without them, Roswell and Beatrice would not be deterred, although he wouldn't say it since Beatrice would absolutely hate it. Myzelda, those two couldn't be more in sync. Garfield, we absolutely can't let them hear that. As with Garfield's thoughts, Myzelda gave the exact same assessment, while showing off coordination that could only be described like that. Beatrice, unaware of what they were thinking, lowered her eyebrows and called out Roswell. Beatrice, going to touch them just once. In fact, Roswell, how reckless. After saying this, Beatrice lightly kicked the ground with her foot and jumped forward. With a flutter of the hem of her dress, Beatrice's small body soared like a feather. This was also an unnatural jump, her own weight eliminated by using yin magic. As it was, Beatrice was headed for a single undead who had its back to her. Sensing Beatrice's approach, it turned around to face her. Roswell, jeweled. A moment later, the undead's right hand that held a sword was vaporized as it was about to strike Beatrice with it. Roswell was pointing at the undead. A white light that had emitted from his fingertip had burned the opponent's arm. The undead was stiffened in astonishment, and Beatrice placed her hand on its forehead. Then Beatrice's distinctive patterned eyes widened. Beatrice, as expected, I suppose. Beatrice grumbled as her body was pulled away by an arm around her slender waist. Holding Beatrice's body close, Roswell exchanged places with her and delivered a sharp fist with the arm opposite the one holding her, shattering the undead's head before it could regain its composure. Roswell, good grief, I'm the one who is going to get scolded by Subaru-kun. Beatrice, and it's Betty who will get all the praise from Subaru. In fact, it's restoration magic, I suppose. Roswell, so that's the reason. Roswell, who had complained about Beatrice's recklessness, closed his yellow eye at what he was told instead of an apology. The current interaction with the undead gave Beatrice some kind of certainty. It seemed that Roswell understood this in a few words, but unfortunately, Garfield had no clue what it meant. Garfield, oi, I don't understand at all. Explain it in a way that even Emilia Summer could understand. Beatrice, essentially, Emilia and Garfield are about the same in terms of their comprehension. In fact, now we know the structure of the zombies' bodies and the mechanism behind it, I suppose. Garfield, like I asked, what the hell does that mean? Garfield asked the question with gnashed teeth. Garfield was already aware of the existence of restoration magic. It was a magic that could restore damaged objects, and he heard that the best users could even restore burned books from ashes. However, it was said that there were few users, and that there were also noticeable shortcomings, such as the need for exquisite magical precision and the tendency for restored items to deteriorate in quality, and above all, life could never be restored. This was not restoration nor repair, but the forbidden realm of something like the sacrament of the immortal king that had been brought up a few times already. Roswell, teacher, chose mana for her vessels, and I chose blood for mine. But this enemy chose earth for their vessels. Are they not bothered if the contents overflow? Roswell, covering his mouth, spoke of the revelation that Beatrice had given him. Even then, Garfield's understanding fell short of theirs, but he could intuit that it was a path that would lead to answers that were terribly disturbing and unpleasant even for Garfield. Disregarding Garfield, Roswell looked at Beatrice with a grim expression on his face. Roswell, Beatrice, this isn't the sacrament of the immortal king, right? Beatrice, the basis is the same, but the approach is different. In fact,
for the sacrament of the immortal king the vessel comes first, and the soul second, I suppose.
However, as for these zombies, Roswell, the soul comes first, and the vessel after. The body changes form to suit the soul. At Roswell's comment, Beatrice nodded deeply. As usual, Garfield could not understand the crucial part of the exchange between the two. Garfield, holding back his bitterness, suddenly could not believe his eyes. Garfield. Roswell was there with an expression that reflected even more anguish on his face than Garfield did. He had never imagined he could have this contorted expression on his face. Nay, Garfield had hoped to punch him in the stomach someday, wanting to bring about an anguished face, but for a reason unrelated to Garfield's desire, Roswell was in agony. With that agony reflected in his eyes, Roswell opened his mouth. Roswell, I think I might know who this enemy is. Garfield, hey, for real. Then, Roswell, but, wait. That can't be. After all, by my hand, she was. Gone was the composure he had just prior, and Roswell's voice was filled with hesitation and doubt. At his demeanor of not stating things clearly, Garfield blinked and then immediately bared his teeth. If it had been Garfield himself, it was possible that some absurd idea would have popped up. However, it was Roswell, not Garfield, who had come up with the thought. Garfield, bastard, this ain't the time to be uttering such weakness. Roswell, Beatrice, Roswell, clarify one thing. In fact, Garfield leaned forward as if wanting to grab Roswell by the collar. However, before his hand could stretch out in aggression, Beatrice's voice struck the silent Roswell. Beatrice fixed her eyes on Roswell, and after waiting for him to meet her gaze, Beatrice, the cause of your hesitation, is it related to mother, I suppose? Roswell, am I that easy to read? Beatrice, only matters related to mother can upset you so much, in fact. Also, more recently, about Ram, I suppose. Roswell, I'm confident I'd be overcome by emotions if something happened to you as well. With that, Roswell, who had responded with a wry smile, closed his eyes firmly and tightened his cheeks. Then, having pushed aside the hesitation and weakness from before, he opened his eyes and nodded. Roswell, Beatrice's observation is correct. The mechanism by which the zombies are revived without the original corpse is an application of restoration magic. The prerequisite for this is the invocation of the soul, which is an application of the sacrament of the immortal king. Beatrice, both restoration magic and the sacrament of the immortal king aren't the kind of techniques that can be used immediately upon understanding the theory. In fact, to begin with, given the feat of combining such fundamentally different types of magic, it can't be said that there are even a handful of geniuses who can do it, I suppose. Those who could do it would be Roswell, of teacher's lineage. However, it cannot be teacher. Therefore, the teacher that Roswell spoke of and the mother that Beatrice spoke of were the same person, and by no means could it be said that that person was completely unrelated to Garfield. Although it could be confusing because there were multiple people with the same name, when he heard that the name of that which was involved, Garfield immediately understood. A single word from Beatrice had cut through Roswell's agony, and his attitude of trying to admit what he did not want to admit might have also played a role in Garfield's understanding. However, my Zelda, what a boorish gaze. Suddenly, my Zelda murmured in a low voice, because it was about the intricacies of magic. My Zelda, who probably could not keep up with the conversation between Roswell and Beatrice any more than Garfield, had given up on understanding the cause of Roswell's agony and was focusing solely on attacking the undead. The woman had stopped in her tracks, and she was looking upwards with her fierce eyes narrowed in aggression. Garfield also looked towards the target of the hunter's piercing gaze and choked up. Not only Garfield, but Beatrice and Roswell as well. However, the reason behind the reactions from those three was slightly different. For Garfield, it was because he saw a familiar figure that should not have been there. For Beatrice and Roswell, it appeared that a more negative feeling was the reason. In the night sky, with long, fluttering pink hair, was a girl clad in black. Her face was the same as the being Garfield had admired ever since he could remember. However, with cold eyes that had never been directed at Garfield, she was looking down at him. Girl, this was not desired, but implementation was successful. Seemingly, this world has recognized my existence as its own life. The familiar face murmured in a familiar voice, gently tracing the crack that ran through her face with her hand and glaring at Garfield and the others through her golden irises. In response, Roswell swallowed his saliva with an audible gulp and opened his mouth. Roswell, so, you were alive. Sphinx, no, I am dead. Observation, required, with an indifferent voice as if teasing, the girl with an appearance that looked exactly like Yazoo, Garfield's grandmother the witch, Sphinx, with the face of an undead, declared so.